The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. When John the Baptist heard in prison what Jesus was doing, he sent word by his disciples. And they came and they said to Jesus, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we be waiting for somebody else?" Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you see and hear. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have the good news brought to them, and blessed is anyone who does not take offense at me." As they went away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. "What did you go out into the wilderness to look at? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? Someone dressed in fine robes? Those who wear fine robes you find in royal palaces. So what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, 'See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way before you.' Truly I tell you, of all the men born of women, there is none greater than John the Baptist. And yet, the least in the kingdom is greater than John." The Gospel of the Lord. Last week, somebody put a book on the table in the waiting room in my office in Los Altos. Now, in this waiting room, we have a little mini library of books and journals and magazines so people can read while they're waiting. And my colleague Michael Priddy puts lots of stuff there. So I presume it was he who did it. But in between clients, one day last week, I was in the waiting room just looking on the table, and I saw this book. And the title of the book was, "Lies Your Teacher Told You." I don't know if any of you have seen it or read it. "Lies Your Teacher Told You." And I picked it up and I was browsing in it for 3 or 4 minutes, and it was a rewriting of American history. And at the beginning was a little survey that had been conducted, which found that of the 19 main topics which are taught in high schools throughout America, consistently over 40 or 50 years, right across the country, consistently, the most boring topic taught in schools, according to the students, is history. Almost everybody put it at the end of their list. And I look at what we've done with history, and this book talks about it. History is always an account of battles. We've reduced the human trajectory to battles and savagery and violence, in which we are always the good guys, and they are always the bad guys, and we win all the battles. We never mention the battles we lose. We only talk about the battles we win. And we justify our violence as crusades against the axes of evil, and we demonize their violence as terrorism or guerrilla fighting, or whatever other term you want to give to it. And I wonder then why kids are not interested in this, why they find this boring. How you can reduce the extraordinary, exquisitely choreographed dance that God has with planet Earth and the evolution of this planet, how you can reduce it so drably to what we find in our history books. How you can reduce this extraordinary song of the universe to a record with as much poetic profundity as an Excel spreadsheet. And then we wonder why kids are bored by history. History, properly understood, is not a record of human violence. It's not an account of wars fought and won. It is the evolution of spirit. It is the trajectory of the Spirit of God as it moves forward to the revelation of Christ consciousness, to the production of a species who will remember who they really are. This is what history is meant to be. Instead of that, we have reduced it to these dull Excel spreadsheets which bore kids to death. So that's what I'm going to talk about today for a few minutes. I'm going to make 5 main points this morning. I'm going to talk firstly about Jesus' job description. And then I'm going to talk about Jesus and John the Baptist. And then thirdly, I will talk about Jesus and John the Baptist and the Buddha. And then fourthly, I will say, and the rest of the cast is as follows. And then fifthly, I want to talk about from reason to self-reflection and beyond. So they're the 5 points I'll make rather quickly this morning. For the first one is Jesus' job description. If you were listening very carefully to the gospel reading this morning, the story says that John the Baptist was in prison. And he heard about this character called Jesus from Nazareth. And he's wondering, could this guy be the Messiah? But John wasn't sure. So, imprisoned as he was, he sent out delegates to inquire of Jesus, are you the guy we're been waiting for since Isaiah 741 years ago? Or should we be waiting for somebody else? And being an Irishman as he was, Jesus replied with a question of his own. He says, well, what do you see? Go back and tell John what you see. The blind see, the deaf hear, the lame walk, the dead are raised to life, the poor have the good news preached to them. Go back and tell John that. Now, Matthew's account is pretty pathetic, to tell you the truth. Luke takes the very same incident and he does it much more poetically. So Matthew manages to put Jesus' job description in his own kind of spreadsheet. It was just a list of qualities which I have just mentioned. Luke does it much more powerfully, although Luke in fact is plagiarizing the prophet Isaiah. Luke does it in a little poem of 5 lines. According to Luke's account, he says, go back and tell John what you see. The poor have the good news preached to them. The blind see. The imprisoned are liberated. Those who are locked up are set free. And I'm proclaiming a year of favor from the Lord. Now, I want you to understand this is Semitic poetry at its best. In typical poetry, in Greek poetry for instance, if there's a 5-line stanza, you move through 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, and the climax is going to be in number 5. In Hebrew, it's very, very different. The Hebrews had a much more complicated poetical system in which they spiraled into the climax. And so you had to listen much more carefully to a Hebrew poem than you would to one coming from the Greeks. The Greeks would go from line 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. You had the climax in 5, then you could forget about the lead up and just focus on the climax. But in the Hebrew poetry, you spiraled to the climax. And so in this 5-line poem, even though you read it from line 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, the meaning doesn't go like that. The meaning goes from line 1 to line 5 to line 2 to line 4, and the climax is in line 3. So as you're listening to a Hebrew poem, you have to hold the entirety of it in your consciousness. You can't let go of any piece. In Greek, you can let go of the first 4 lines because you know ultimately the climax is coming in the last line. So you don't have to pay a whole lot of attention. In Hebrew poetry, as the poem begins, you have no idea how many lines it's going to contain. So you have to hold all the information in your head. You have to count the lines, and then you have to find the middle line. And you realize then that's where the climax was. So it's a much more complicated. No wonder the Hebrews became great physicists, holding all that kind of information. And so here's the poem as it was recited by Jesus, but here's the meaning as it was meant by Jesus. So he says, I come to preach good news to the poor, liberty to captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to set the imprisoned free, and to preach a year of favor from the Lord. Now the Hebrew audience said, okay, we've heard, right, 5 lines. And the meaning is going to go from 1 to 5 to 2 to 4 to 3. And 1 and 5 are going to parallel each other, and 2 and 4 are going to parallel each other in what's called Semitic parallelism, so another form of poetry built into it. So I've come to preach good news to the poor, proclaim a year of favor from the Lord, so both of these are about good news, liberty to captives, to set the imprisoned free, both of those are the same, and the climax will be in line 3. And the climax is to give recovery of sight to the blind. So the Hebrew mentality is listening with this spiral mindset, holding all of the data together until finally they conclude where the center is and what the climax is about. So it's a much more active and a much more attentive exercise than just listening to a piece of Greek poetry. And when Jesus gets to the very center and says, and this is the core of my mission, indeed I have come to preach good news. Indeed, I have come to set captives free. But the core of my mission The core of my mission is to give recovery of sight to the blind. Now, every single word in this is very carefully chosen. He did not say, I have come to give sight to the blind. He said, I have come to give recovery of sight to the blind. What does that indicate? It means that we were not created blind. We were not created blind. We were created sighted. So how did we become blind? And Jesus' mission is to help us recover our sight. He is not giving us sight because we were not created blind. So how did our blindness happen? It happens in two great phases. The first eye is blinded by incarnation. As soon as we incarnate and we come onto this little planet and we take up these space suits of ours, we have to cram cosmic consciousness into 1350 cc of brain power. We have to cram eternity into this tiny little 150-pound spacesuit. We have to forget completely where we've come from, who we are, and what our mission is. At least that's what happens. So one eye is blinded by incarnation, and the second eye is blinded by education. Little babies come in. This little baby, Kyle, here. Although he has no recollection right now of who he really is way back, he is not blinded. He remembers one of his eyes is fully open. He remembers that he's a child of God. He remembers that he's an eternal being. He remembers that he was never born, and he remembers that he will never die. He's a bite-sized piece of God who chose to have a human experience. One of his eyes is wide open. Unfortunately, I hope it doesn't happen with him. I hope the education system is better prepared for Kyle than it was for you and for me. That our education system and our cultural trance doesn't start blinding the other eye, because that's what the cultural trance does. The cultural trance blinds the second eye. Having experienced amnesia during incarnation for who we really are and what we're really about, education does the rest for us. The culture and the trance in which we live blinds the other eye. And therefore, of all the things Jesus came to do, the single most important thing was to help us recover our sight. And this list that he performed today, this is not about physical cures. The physical cures indeed did happen, but they're only symptoms of what's really happening at the core. And so I like to go back again and again and again to this great story in John chapter 9 of the blind man who used to sit outside the walls of Jericho begging alms. And Jesus cured him. And then there's a whole bunch of interrogations. The Pharisees interrogate the blind man because they don't believe he's been born blind. And then they interrogate his parents because they don't believe. And then they interrogate Jesus. And then they drag the man back again and they interrogate him a second time. And then there's a final confrontation between Jesus and the Pharisees. And the climax of it is, they say to Jesus, are you saying that we're blind? And Jesus said, if you knew you were blind, I could heal you. It's because you don't realize you're blind that you're going to remain stuck in your blindness. And so the real blindness that Jesus came to heal is not physical blindness, although he did indeed do that. But that was not his purpose. His purpose was to restore sight. It was to roll back the amnesia created by incarnation and to roll back the amnesia created by our educational systems. So when we look at Jesus' job description today, it is primarily about restoring sight to us, so that every single one of us can break through the fog of the cultural trance of being part of Homo sapiens on planet Earth in December 2007. And that we can remember truly that we are only one entity. There is only one being on this planet. There is God in human form. And the fact that that's articulated at the moment in 6.5 billion little pieces doesn't mean we're separate from each other any more than the mushrooms that grow on the forest floor are individual entities. They're merely eruptions of a mycelium, which is a huge underground organism. One of them is so big it covers 4 states of the Union. It's a single entity sending up these little shoots. Every single one of us on the planet is merely a mushroom on the mycelium of the human species. And when we get that, we're in business. And that's what Jesus came to do, to open our eyes to that realization. And that was his job description, and that's what he set about doing. That's my first point. The second point then, I want to talk about Jesus and John the Baptist. Because as we read through the biblical accounts in the New Testament, they are very, very confusing. The New Testament itself can't figure out exactly what was the relationship between Jesus and John the Baptist. They're all over the place. Luke creates a story which suggests that they were cousins. And he has this great story that they actually met in utero. That when Elizabeth was 6 months pregnant and Mary was newly pregnant and Mary came to visit her, that John the Baptist in utero recognized his cousin in Mary's womb and he jumped for joy. So according to Luke, they were cousins. Matthew's account today in chapter 11 would have us believe they were total strangers to each other. John has no idea who this guy is, but he hears reports about what he's doing and he wants to know, are you the person we've been waiting for? So the entire spectrum is there, from cousins to total strangers. There's other stories in the Bible that suggest that Jesus was a disciple of John the Baptist, and that John was the leader of some kind of a spiritual reform movement, and Jesus was a devotee of John, and in fact got baptized by John. And then when John got killed, that Jesus was kind of pushed reluctantly into the leadership position of this young movement. There's basis for that in Scripture as well. There's a belief system that they were both colleagues in the Essene community in Qumran, that they lived in the desert of Judea together as colleagues before they began their public ministry. And then there's a belief in the same scriptures that in fact John was the precursor and Jesus was the Messiah. So the Bible is all over the place in this relationship between Jesus and John. So what was the relationship? Interesting what Jesus' comments are at the end of today's gospel, when they've gone back to John to report what Jesus is doing, what Jesus said. And then Jesus turns to the crowd and he says, what about John the Baptist? You guys went off into the desert to hear him preach. What drew you? Did you go to see a reed shaking in the wind? In other words, somebody who was just taking public polls, opinion polls, and going wherever the poll suggested? Was this guy who was pushed around by lobbyists or special interests? No, that's not John. Did you go out into the desert with somebody dressed in fine linen and feasting sumptuously every day? You find that in palaces, royal palaces. That's not John. So what did you go out to see? A prophet? You betcha. Of all the men born of women, there's never been a greater than John the Baptist. And the crowd are sitting there with their mouths open. Of all the men born of women, there has never been a greater than John the Baptist. So they're saying, you mean he's greater than Moses? He's greater than our father Abraham? And then Jesus does what only Jesus can do. He delivers himself of what I call a Jesusism. He says, but the least born in the kingdom is greater than John. He just turned the whole thing on his head. How in God's name can John be the greatest thing that ever happened? Of all humans ever born, there's none greater than John the Baptist, and still the least born in the kingdom is greater than John? What the hell are you talking about? So to find out what the hell he's talking about, I have to go to point 3. I have to go back 550 years before this. And my third point is Jesus and John the Baptist and the Buddha. Now the Buddha, born Gautama Siddhartha, a prince of the realm, 550 years before Jesus Christ. He lived his life in 3 significant sections. He was born into utter privilege, and the prophecy was at his birth that he would either become a world savior or he would become the greatest king of all time in India. And guess which one his daddy wanted? So his daddy surrounded him with all kinds of privilege and prestige, and he refused to let anybody near him who was old or sick or dying. So for the first 29 years of his life, Gautama Siddhartha, who would become the Buddha, never saw an old person, never saw a sick person, and never saw a dead person. And then in a series of nightly excursions, when he left the temple secretly with a companion of his, and he came across old people and sick people and a corpse being taken to the ghats to be burned, it totally revolutionized his life. And he crept into his bedroom where his 1-year-old son was sleeping and his wife, and he kissed them both, and he left the palace, and he began the second stage of his life. And he lived this stage for 6 years. He became the ultimate ascetic. Finally, we are told, managing to survive on a single grain of rice a day. Because he was convinced he was going to make himself enlightened. He was going to be the ultimate ascetic, and he was going to find enlightenment. And after 6 years of practicing this more diligently than anybody before him, he was still as dumb as he had been when he was a privileged prince of the realm. And so he found a different way. For the rest of his life, from age 35 until he died at the age of 80, he found what he called the middle way. Not the privilege of the prince, and not the asceticism of the desert, but the middle path. He discovered what he called anitya, impermanence, that you can't step into the same river twice. He discovered what he called anatma, that there is no separate self, that we are all, in fact, united. And he discovered that the source of all human suffering is the human mind, its desires, its fears, and its anxieties. And he said, by overcoming that, you experience nirvana and total freedom. Now, why am I talking about the Buddha? I'm talking about the Buddha because, in a sense, John the Baptist recapitulated the two first phases of the Buddha's life, and Jesus was the third phase of the Buddha's life. It's very possible that Jesus is another reincarnation of Gautama Siddhartha. Who knows? The first two phases were the following. John the Baptist, too, was born into privilege. John was the son of a priest, and therefore, relatively speaking, he would have been born into relative affluence. John had a very easy time of it for the first few years of his life. But at some stage, John got hit by the bug of enlightenment as well. And just like the Buddha, 550 years before him, he went off to be alone, to fast. And John finally was surviving much longer than the Buddha, maybe for 15 or 18 years. John survived on locusts and wild honey, living in the desert. And so in a sense, there is phase 1 and phase 2 of the Buddha's life. And John is the incarnation of that. And then came Jesus. And when Jesus came, what did the crowd say? They said, look, a drunkard and a glutton. He's hanging out with tax collectors and prostitutes and sinners. Because Jesus was not into asceticism, and Jesus was not into princely comfort. Jesus was into the middle way. And what is the middle way? I don't mean the easy way. I don't mean mediocrity. I mean the way of love. The way of realization that I and the Father are one. You are in me, and I am in you, and we are in him. That there is only one being. There's only God playing hide and go seek with God. And with that realization, there is unity consciousness. And that is the middle way. We don't have to beat up on our bodies. We don't have to be ultimate ascetics. And we're certainly not going to get there by self-gratification. We're going to get there when we realize there's only one of us. And that one is God in human guise. Everything that exists is merely God playing hide and go seek with herself. Rocks are God sleeping, plants are God waking up, animals are God walking, and human beings are God thinking. And Christ-conscious human beings are God becoming aware of herself. And that's the relationship between John the Baptist and Jesus and the Buddha. Which brings me to my fourth point. And the rest of the cast is as follows. One of the things that fascinates me about human history is that in this bubbling forth of spirit, people don't come as individual souls to do great things. They always come in little soul pods. And they often come even with their soulmates. So you look, for instance, at 550 years before Christ, in China, two soulmates arrive at the same time. One of them we call Lao Tzu, and the other called Confucius. Lao Tzu and Confucius. Both radically reinventing Chinese society at a time when China was in utter chaos. These will become two of the greatest teachers of all time. Arguably, Confucius was the most prolific and successful teacher in human history. For 2,500 years, his system dominated over a third of the population of the world. Arguably, the most effective and successful teacher of all time. He and Lao Tzu were contemporaries. Soulmates, in a sense, in China. Further to the west, around the same period of time, you had Gautama Siddhartha, the Buddha, being born, and at the same time, Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, a beautiful, beautiful spiritual system based on utter respect for all living things. These come into India at the same time. Further to the west, in Israel, around a very critical period, around 600 BC, you have Jeremiah and Ezekiel coming as soulmates. One staying in the land of Israel during exile, and the other accompanying the exiles into Babylon, but working together in a sense. Further west still, you have three great soulmates appearing just one after the other. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, pupils and teachers of each other. And so they've always come in little soul pods. And there have been critical periods in this journey. There have been critical periods, one of which is called the axial age. From about 800 years before Christ to 200 years before Jesus Christ, there was an extraordinary outpouring of spirit on planet Earth. With Lao Tzu and Confucius in China, Mahavira and the Buddha in India, Zoroaster in Persia, the great prophets in Israel, and the great thinkers in Greece, extraordinary pouring out. And then the spirit went quiet for about 200 years. And then came an extraordinary teacher, possibly the most enlightened of all, Jesus the Christ, 200 years after this. And Jesus did not come alone any more than the others came alone. Jesus came in with a retinue of soulmates to precipitate this shift in human consciousness. One of them being his mother, I believe. Another Mary of Magdalene, and a third John the Baptizer. And they came as a little soul pod to come in to shift this, because we never come alone. We always come with a group to try to create this work. And this is how the movement happens. Now, when you look at the great trajectory of just universe of ours, and this is one universe among millions and billions. I was reading an article last night by Brian Greene, this mathematician and physicist in Columbia. And there's a lot of credence at the moment in physics that we live in multiverses, that they're like little bubbles in a bath, that this universe of ours is just a single bubble, and that these are connected to each other. But we know at least this little bubble of ours is 13.5 billion years of age. It took this universe of ours 9 billion years to birth planet Earth. It took planet Earth 500 million years to birth life. This life evolved, and right down only 2 million years ago was reason created. Only 40,000 years ago did we discover soul. And only 2,500 years ago did the avatars begin coming among us. It is very, very recent. This bubbling of spirit into the human experiment is very, very recent. In a universe of 13.5 billion years of age, only for 2,500 years have the avatars been coming among us. But they're coming among us. And they're coming more and more frequently. And they're bubbling more and more ferociously in our times. Which brings me to my fifth point. The movement from reason to self-reflection. One of the great gifts that nature has bestowed upon the human family in our trajectory, in our evolutionary trajectory, was the ability to think rationally, an extraordinary ability. We could organize consistently our thinking. We could overcome instinctual behavior. But unfortunately, like a lot of other great human characteristics, it has been prostituted in the service of greed. How else can we explain warfare? How else can we justify genocide? No thinking, rational being can justify taking the life of another human being. And therefore, to take life, and to take life in the quantities in which we are taking life, means that we've bastardized reason. We've prostituted reason to political and economic and religious agendas. And so nature responded by giving us an even more beautiful gift. It gave us the gift of self-reflection. Not only can we think rationally, we can think self-reflectively. We can critique our own thinking. We can critique our own behavior. We can critique the mores of our culture and our tribe and its behavior and its foreign policy and its domestic policy. And this was the birth of prophecy. This only happened on planet Earth about 1,000 years before Jesus Christ, with the great beginning of the Hebrew prophets. When these people, men and women, had the chutzpah to stand in front of individual monarchs and challenge them on individual acts of injustice. And then they would take it even further, and they would challenge the legislated behavior of entire cultures. where we've incorporated injustices into the very legislation that we promote. And these people have stood against it consistently in every country in the world, including our own, the Martin Luther Kings of the world. And the response has always been, the forces of darkness have always tried to quench it. And they've done this in two ways. They have dumbed the masses. They've given us food and entertainment to take our minds off spirit, whether it's TV and pizza of today or it's the bread and circuses of Roman times. We have dumbed the masses by entertaining them and just giving them enough food to get by. And then we've executed the prophets. So those who refuse to be dumbed, we have jailed and we have executed. And this is the story of John the Baptist, and this is the story of Martin Luther King, and this is the story of Jesus, and this is the story of Mahatma Gandhi, every one of them. But you can't damp it. You cannot kill spirit. You cannot quench spirit any more than there's a great Irish song called Galway Bay, and there's one line in it that says, the British can no more dampen the Gaelic spirit than you could chase a moonbeam or light a penny candle from a star. It can't be done. You cannot quench spirit. You can temporarily attempt to obstruct it, but you can't quench it. Because spirit is not being led, the revolution of evolution is not being led by any single man. It is not being led even by any group of people. It's not being led by any culture, and it's not peculiar to any epoch in human history. It is the sacred song of the Spirit, and it cannot be impeded. And that's the whole Christmas story. The Christmas story is not about the birth of a Christ child 2,000 years ago in a stable. It's not the mawkish sentimentality of wise men coming from the east and a star overhead and Herod trying to kill them all. It's not about that at all. It's not the birth of a Christ child. It is the birth of Christ consciousness. And it is a birth that has to happen one heart at a time. It didn't happen just once in human history. So Meister Eckhart would say, every single one of us is meant to be the mother of God. If this Christmas is merely about gifts and consumerism, or even if it's merely about remembering the Christ child born 2,000 years ago, it's a waste of your time and it's a waste of your breath. If you are not prepared to birth Christ consciousness this Christmas, then it's just like the last 2,000. It won't take us anywhere.